My father yelled down the phone at 2 in the morning, demanding I empty my living room. Okay, prepare yourselves for this, because I still can't believe it happened. Can you imagine getting a terrifying 2 a.m. phone call, not from a stranger, but from your own father, demanding you clear out your apartment by sunrise for a truckload of freight he secretly signed for under your name? That night, my world turned upside down, and it revealed a betrayal that cut deeper than any words could describe. My phone screamed at me that night, buzzing against the nightstand like a frantic insect. I'd only been asleep for an hour and a half, real, deep sleep after a brutal 16-hour server migration that almost crashed a client's entire payment system. I answered, instinctively, without even looking at the screen. I already knew that goddamn ringtone. "Clear the living room," he said. "No hello, no apology for the hour. You have until sunrise." I sat bolt upright in the dark. "Clear it of what?" I asked, my voice thick with sleep. "Freight's coming at 8,500 pounds. I need the space to stage it before the second truck arrives at the warehouse." I flicked on my lamp, my hands already clammy. "Dad, I don't have a warehouse. I have a one-bedroom apartment." He brushed it off. "It's temporary. A few hours, maybe a day. Desmond's already got the proxy on file." That word, proxy, it hit me like a cold wave. I hadn't authorized anything with my building. I grabbed my laptop, the blue light harsh in the dark room, and pulled up the resident portal. And there it was, a notification I'd never approved. "Freight delivery 6 a.m. loading dock access. Temporary elevator override authorized under Claire Bailey." My name, my unit number, a digital signature I had never signed. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the only sound the quiet ticking of the radiator. That specific, sickening cold washed over me, the feeling of watching your own name get used against you, in real time, before you've even had a chance to wake up and fight back. "Dad," I managed. "What did you do?" "Your brother needs staging space for his new venture. We're using your place. Stop being difficult, Claire. I don't have time for this." Before I called him back, I dialed the building's after-hours line. Desmond picked up, his voice heavy with sleep. "Miss Bailey, your father emailed clearance about an hour ago. Said you were unavailable. Said it was a family emergency." I logged it as verified. "Cancel it, Desmond," I pleaded. "Cancel the proxy right now." There was a pause, the sound of keys clicking. "I can flag it, but I'll need building management to confirm in the morning." I couldn't wait. "Kill it tonight, Desmond. Please." I hung up and called my father again. He was yelling before the phone even reached my ear. "You'd let your own brother go under, because you want to be stubborn? Do you know what demurrage fees cost if that truck sits? Then rent a storage unit," I said, my voice coming out flatter and colder than I expected, like it belonged to someone else. "After everything we sacrificed for you, this is what we get," he roared. "Let's talk about sacrifice." I shot back, and I honestly don't know where the calm came from, except that I'd been waiting years to say it. The property taxes I covered last spring, the jet ski on my card, the Vegas markers, 30 wire transfers, Dad. I have the receipts. He bellowed about family helping family, about me sitting in my nice apartment, forgetting where I came from, forgetting who paid for the life I thought I built on my own. I told him, family doesn't forge a signature and hijack an elevator. His voice dropped then, low and almost quiet, which was always worse than the yelling. "If that truck gets turned away tomorrow, you can consider yourself cut off. Don't bother calling for the holidays." "Understood," I said, and I hung up. I didn't sleep again that night. At 4 a.m., I sat in the lobby with Desmond, watching him painstakingly strip every old proxy off my unit and rebuild the access list from scratch. Biometric lock. My thumbprint only. Nobody else's. At 5:50 a.m., I stood on that loading dock in 12-degree cold, my breath fogging under the sodium lights, waiting to see if my own father would actually go through with it. The truck rolled up at 6 sharp, air brakes hissing, headlights slicing through the dark. My father got out first, waving a clipboard like it was a badge. Tyler, my brother, climbed down behind him, sunglasses on despite the hour, A fresh jacket zipped his chin like he was the one closing the deal. Override the system. Tyler barked at Harland, the stocky dock supervisor who hadn't said a word yet. It's under her name. Just let us through. Harland checked his tablet unhurriedly and shook his head. Not authorized, sir. My father spotted me near the loading bay and lunged toward me, his face red with fury in the cold. You're destroying his business. You understand that? You're ruining him over nothing. I held up my phone, turning the screen toward him. First, the forged clearance email, then the spreadsheet. 30 line items, red numbers glowing under the dock lights. Warehouse workers stopped stacking pallets to watch. The truck driver cut his engine. For a second, the whole dock went quiet, save for the hum of a distant forklift. You're dead to me, my father said, low and vicious. The words landed harder than any yelling ever had. Understood, I said again, and I didn't blink. He snatched his clipboard off the ground where he dropped it and stormed toward the exit ramp. Tyler scrambled after him, already dialing someone, his voice fading into the dark. I stood on that dock until the truck pulled away, empty. Until Harland told me I could go home and get some sleep. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. It would take 2 more days for me to understand just how far from over it actually was. I'm 29, a senior systems security analyst at Northgate Data Solutions in Denver. My days are spent auditing companies for the exact kind of unauthorized access my father had just used against me. The irony isn't lost on me. I live alone in Unit 14C at the Wilmot, a place I earned after 3 years of putting every spare dollar into savings, instead of a life. I don't say that to sound like a martyr, but because it matters. That apartment, that credit history, that carefully rebuilt financial identity was what my father decided he had a right to use. My father, Robert Bailey, is 58. For 20 years, he ran Bailey Freight and Logistics, a business he built from a single truck into a modest regional operation. It was good once. I grew up watching him at the kitchen table, my mother, Diane, a second-grade teacher, balancing the books around whatever the freight business hadn't swallowed that month. But there were years, I realized in hindsight, when the business quietly bled money, and no one was allowed to say so. Everything changed in 2019 when a warehouse fire destroyed $60,000 of uninsured inventory. He never really recovered. He downsized, took out loans against our house, and started treating every dollar that came near him, including mine, like it was his to allocate. My brother, Tyler, 24, is the son my father always wanted. For his 16th birthday, Tyler got a paid-for-use Civic. I got a bus pass and a part-time job. Tyler's college tuition was covered for 2 degrees he never finished. I paid for mine myself, working nights. I wasn't bitter then, not exactly. It just taught me early that the ledger in my family would never balance, and the only way to survive was to stop expecting it to. I remember one dinner, the winter I turned 17. I'd made regional finals for a statewide accounting competition, something huge to me. I brought the plaque home, set it on the counter. My father glanced at it for 4 seconds, then asked Tyler, who just failed his driver's test for the 2nd time, if he wanted to retake it that weekend. I put the plaque in my closet and never brought it up again. It wasn't cruelty, more like blindness, an inability to see me clearly unless I was either providing something he needed or failing to. My accomplishments simply didn't register. My mother noticed, I think, more than she ever said. She'd find small ways to make up for it. An extra 10 minutes at bedtime, a favorite meal. Quiet compliments delivered when my father wasn't around to redirect the conversation. I loved her for those small corrections, but even as a teenager, I knew they were in the margins. The center belonged to my father's moods and my brother's needs. The incident that should have taught me everything happened in 2019, right after the fire. I was 22, freshly graduated, working my first real job. My father asked me to co-sign a $15,000 equipment loan. He said it would be paid off in 6 months. I trusted him. I signed. He made 2 payments and stopped. The loan went to collections without a single warning call. I found out that November when a leasing company denied my application for my first solo apartment. I sat in my car outside that leasing office, reading the denial letter 3 times, unable to comprehend. I called my father, crying. He apologized, promised it would never happen again, said he was ashamed. He paid off the balance eventually in 2020. For a while, I let myself believe the apology meant something. "You're my daughter," he'd said. "I'd never let something actually hurt you." This was a mistake, not a betrayal. At 22, grieving the apartment I'd mentally moved into, that distinction felt important. Mistake versus betrayal. I clung to it, because the alternative, that someone who loved me would simply decide my financial life was an acceptable casualty of his own, was too much to bear. I moved into a smaller, worse apartment that winter, further from work, telling myself it was temporary. It took me 2 more years to save enough to try again. With a stronger credit file, I'd rebuilt inch by inch. I made a private, unspoken rule: never let my name touch anything of his again. I broke it twice more before the story ended. $4,000 for Tyler's car. A handful of smaller favors. Rules like that rarely break all at once. They erode quietly, one reasonable exception at a time, until one morning you're standing on a loading dock, wondering how you got there. It took me years to understand his apology had been damage control. Everything after followed the same pattern. Take first, apologize only if caught, and frame it so forgiveness felt like the only reasonable response. My mother played her part, too. Not maliciously, but from a kind of learned helplessness after 32 years of marriage to a man who never admitted a mistake without blaming someone else. She loved us, but she never learned how to protect us from him. By 29, I had rebuilt my credit twice, had a savings account I never mentioned, and learned to keep receipts for everything, not paranoia, but a compliance analyst's instinct for documentation. That instinct would save me 8 months later, though I didn't know it then. Standing on that dock, I thought this was the worst he could do. I was wrong. To understand how that truck ended up at my apartment, you need to go back 6 months. This wasn't sudden. It was a slow escalation, and I let each step happen because each one seemed survivable. It started in September. My father called casual, like asking about the weather. "I need you to send me your business banking login. Just to look at, not to use. A supplier wants to see I've got someone with real financial standing backing the operation." Asked why they'd need my banking. "It's just for appearances, Claire. Nobody's going to touch your account." I said no, plainly, without apology. He went quiet, a punishing silence. Then he said, "Real family trusts each other," and hung up. I thought I'd drawn a clear line. I didn't know then that with my father, a line you drew once wasn't a line. It was a starting point for negotiation. For days later, he called back, as if that conversation never happened. He asked if I'd let his business list my Northgate compliance work as a professional reference on a supplier application. Nothing financial, he promised. Just my job title and a line about my analytical background. I should have said no. I said yes, reluctantly, telling myself a job title wasn't the same as banking credentials. Months later, reading a wholesale contract, I'd find that same professional description, almost word for word, in a fraudulent supply agreement. He hadn't needed to invent a version of me for that contract. I had unknowingly handed him the real one, in pieces, months before he needed it. 2 months later, in November, Tyler wrapped his Civic around a guardrail. Nobody was hurt. But the car needed $4,000 in repairs neither he nor my father had. My father called me. "Your brother's scared enough as it is. He doesn't need a lecture. He needs the car fixed so he can get to work. You're in a position to help." I sent the $4,000. I told myself it was for Tyler, not for my father. That helping my brother wasn't being used. I still believe that was partly true. But I noticed, even then, that nobody in my family ever asked me how I was doing before they asked me for something. I noticed it, and I filed it away instead of saying it out loud, which is its own kind of mistake. In January, I opened my credit card statement to an $11,200 charge for a jet ski. It took me a full minute to understand. The card wasn't mine, not really. It was a shared family card, opened years ago for household emergencies, one I'd forgotten I was still an authorized user on. My father had never removed me. I called the dealership, then the card company, then removed myself from the account entirely. No discussion. My father found out within the hour. You humiliated me, he screamed. I had a whole plan for that boat, and you cut my legs out from under me over a jet ski. It wasn't yours to charge to a card with my name on it, I said. It's a family card, Claire. That's how families work. My mother called me that night, crying, asking me to just let it go, saying he was under so much stress. I told her I loved her, and I wasn't reopening the account. She cried a little more, said she understood, but her voice made it clear she didn't, not really, and that she'd be absorbing his fallout for the rest of the week. That December, 3 months before the freight incident, we gathered for Christmas. My father was cordial, almost warm, a strategy I now realize. He waited until dessert, the table relaxed, to casually mention a supplier asking if the business had any additional financial backing beyond his own signature. He looked at me when he said it. Nobody else noticed. I changed the subject. He let it drop, smiling, patient, like you're patient with a fish that's going to tire itself out. I left with a headache, the specific exhaustion of watching someone circle you at your own family dinner, testing the water for the next request. By February, a month before the freight, the business was worse than I'd realized. My father asked me directly, at his kitchen table, to co-sign a $50,000 line of credit. You know what happened last time I put my name on something for this business? I said. That was 5 years ago. I've learned. This is different. It's not different. It's the same request with a bigger number. He called me selfish. Tyler weighed in on the family group chat. Real family doesn't let blood go under overpride. 11 family friends and cousins saw it before I muted the thread. I didn't send the money. I didn't co-sign. I went home and cried, not because I doubted my decision, but because I understood he'd keep asking forever, and every no would be repackaged as my character flaw, not his boundary issue. 2 weeks before the dock, something smaller happened. I got a verification email from a wholesale trading platform I didn't recognize, addressed to an old business email I hadn't used since 2021. Someone had tried to reset the password. I assumed it was spam, changed the password back, and moved on. I had no reason to think about it again. Not yet. But I want you to remember that email. Because it comes back later, and when it does, it changes everything I thought I understood about that night on the dock. Which brings us back to that phone call. 2 nights after the escalation had, in my mind, hit its ceiling. My father found a new floor beneath it. He signed a freight delivery under my name, forged a building authorization, and tried to turn my living room into a staging warehouse for a shipment I'd never heard of, for a business venture nobody had told me existed. I thought that was the worst he had in him. It wasn't. Quick pause/sponsor break if this were a real video or a mental beat. 2 days after the dock, I was drafting a calm, careful email to my mother, trying to find language that would let me stay in her life without staying in his, when a new message landed in my business inbox. Not from my father. From a name I didn't recognize. Frank Doyle of Doyle Surplus and Wholesale out of Pueblo. Subject: Payment due, final notice. I opened it, expecting spam. I read it twice before my stomach lurched, understanding what my eyes already had. Frank Doyle was demanding $42,000 for a shipment of liquidated retail inventory, electronics, and small appliances that he claimed I had personally guaranteed under a wholesale supply agreement dated 6 weeks earlier. Attached was a PDF. I opened it, my hand actually shaking, which doesn't happen to me often, not even during the worst network breaches. It was a contract. My name at the top. Claire Bailey. Northgate address listed correctly. A digital signature, carefully typed in cursive, at the bottom, timestamped 11:47 p.m. on a Thursday. I remembered that Thursday clearly. I'd worked until midnight on that server migration and gone straight to bed. I hadn't signed anything. I'd been asleep, exhausted, phone on silent. During the exact window the timestamp claimed I'd been reviewing and executing a $42,000 wholesale agreement. I pulled the document's metadata, out of habit more than hope, as I would for any client audit. The IP address logged against the signature traced to a residential connection in Aurora, Colorado. I didn't need a lookup tool to know whose street that was. I'd grown up on that street. I'd eaten dinner in that kitchen 1,000 times. And then I remembered that email. The verification message from 2 weeks earlier, the one I dismissed as spam, tied to an old freelance business account I hadn't touched since 2021. I hadn't deleted that account. I'd only changed the password back and moved on. I opened my old email archive and searched the address. There it was, buried 3 folders deep. A message from a wholesale trading platform, sent the same week as that verification email, confirming a new business profile had been created using my old freelance credentials as a secondary contact. I had assumed someone had tried and failed to get in. I had been wrong. Someone had tried and succeeded, using details about me that only a handful of people on Earth would have known: an old business address, a childhood pet's name for a security question, my mother's maiden name. I sat with that for a long time before I could make myself keep reading. In my line of work, I spend most days explaining to executives that the biggest security vulnerability in any system is rarely the firewall. It's the person who already has a key. I had built an entire career around that principle and somehow never once applied it to my own family, because the idea that my father was functionally an insider threat had never occurred to me as a category he could belong to. Fathers weren't threat models. Except mine, it turned out, had been running exactly that kind of quiet reconnaissance for months, gathering the small, ordinary details a parent accumulates without ever needing to ask twice, and treating every one of them as a credential. My father hadn't needed to hack anything. He'd simply known me the way only a parent can, and used every piece of that knowledge as a key. He hadn't just tried to borrow my living room for a night. He had spent weeks building a second financial identity for me, quietly, patiently, a wholesale account with my name on it. In order to secure inventory he had no intention of ever paying for himself. The freight truck at dawn hadn't been the plan. It had been the plan's first visible failure. The moment the real scheme, hidden underneath it, had nearly been exposed before it was ready. I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Nguyen, who'd handled my apartment lease and, coincidentally, my original credit dispute back in 2019. I read her the email out loud, my voice cracking somewhere around the dollar figure. She went quiet for a long moment. "This isn't a family dispute anymore, Claire," she said. "This is fraud. You need to file a police report today, before Doyle's noon deadline tomorrow. And you need to do it in writing, with everything you just told me attached." I didn't sleep that night either. I sat at my kitchen island until nearly dawn, building a timeline, dates, dollar amounts, screenshots, the metadata report, the old verification email, the 30-wire transfers from years of quiet loans that had never once been repaid. By 8 the next morning, I had a folder ready for the precinct and a draft statement open on my laptop. I was reading it over one more time when my apartment intercom buzzed. Not the lobby line, my private line, the one only Desmond used, reserved for actual emergencies. I pressed the button, throat tight, before he even spoke. "Miss Bailey," Desmond said, his voice careful in a way I'd never heard from him before. "There's a man down here. Says his name is Frank Doyle. Says he's not leaving the building until you come down and explain yourself." I told Desmond to give me 5 minutes and please, stay close by. I gathered the folder, the metadata printout, the screenshots, everything, and rode the elevator down, my heart pounding harder than it had on that loading dock 2 mornings earlier. Frank Doyle turned out to be an older man, maybe 60, in a canvas work jacket, standing near the mailboxes with his arms crossed and an expression that wasn't angry so much as exhausted. He looked like a man who had already been let down once this month and was bracing to be let down again. "Mr. Doyle," I said, "I'm Claire Bailey. I think we need to sit down." We sat in the lobby's small seating area, Desmond hovering a polite but watchful distance away. I laid out the metadata report first. The IP address, the timestamp that placed me asleep in my own bed while a contract was supposedly being reviewed and signed. Doyle's face changed as he read it, the anger draining into something closer to sick understanding. "He told me you ran a consulting side business," Doyle said quietly. "Said you needed the inventory fast. Said your credit was better than his, so the paperwork would go through cleaner under your name. I've done business with your father for 6 years, Miss Bailey. I trusted him." "So did I said, "for 29 years. Doyle exhaled slowly and rubbed a hand down his face. He called me twice yesterday.
Panicked.
Said there was a delay on the payment, but it was coming. Said his daughter was handling logistics on her end. I've got $42,000 of inventory sitting in a lot in Pueblo I can't move and can't sell to anyone else now that it's tied up in paperwork with your name on it. I was already dialing my father when Doyle said that. He didn't answer the first 2 times. He answered the third, and I put him on speaker right there in the lobby, in front of Doyle and Desmond. "Dad," I said, "Frank Doyle is standing in my lobby. He's got a contract with my forged signature on it. You need to come down here and explain that to both of us right now." There was a long pause, then that particular tone he used when he thought he could still talk his way out of something. "Claire, don't do anything rash. I can fix this. Just give me a few days." "You forged a legal contract using my identity, Dad. There's no fixing that with a few days. I did what I had to do to keep this family's business alive. You wouldn't co-sign. You wouldn't help. So, I found another way. That's what a father does. He finds another way." Doyle's expression, listening to that, told me everything about how this was going to end for my father's reputation in an industry built on handshake trust. "That's not what a father does," Doyle said, loud enough for the phone to catch it. "That's what a con man does, Robert." My father was quiet for a second, then, predictably, he pivoted. "You're both twisting this. I never meant for it to go this far. The business was going under. I panicked. I made a mistake. And now you're both going to destroy me over one bad decision." "It wasn't one decision," I said. "It was the equipment loan in 2019. It was the jet ski. It was the $50,000 ask. You called me selfish for refusing. It was a verification email 2 weeks ago that I now understand was you rebuilding access to an account of mine you had no right to touch. This was never one bad decision. This was a pattern. And I was the only one in this family willing to say that out loud." "You've always thought you were better than us," he said, and his voice cracked in a way that might have moved me once, before I understood how often that crack appeared exactly when he needed sympathy most. "Smarter, cleaner, more responsible. You've been waiting for a reason to cut us off for years." "No," I said, and I meant it. And I said it slowly enough that I knew he'd hear every word. "I spent years hoping you'd give me a reason to stay close. Instead, you kept giving me reasons to leave. I just finally ran out of ways to ignore them." I heard him start to say something else, and I hung up before he could. Desmond, still a few feet away, didn't say anything, but I saw him glance at Doyle with an expression that needed no translation. Doyle exhaled again, longer this time, and looked at me with something that had shifted from suspicion into a kind of tired sympathy. "I'm sorry to have come at you like this," he said. "I should have known better than to trust a signature I never watched get signed." "You had no way of knowing," I told him. "I've known him 29 years, and I didn't see it coming either." Doyle showed me his end of the paperwork while we waited. A standard supply agreement he'd used with my father's company for years without issue. Reading it, I could see exactly how the con had been built to survive a cursory glance. My phone number was listed correctly. My employer was listed correctly. The only fabricated elements were the signature and the claim that I'd reviewed the terms by phone the week before, a call Doyle now realized, sitting there in my lobby, had never actually happened. He'd simply taken my father's word for it because 6 years of on-time payments had never given him a reason to verify. "He used my trust in him to build fake trust in you," Doyle said, shaking his head. "I've never had that happen in 30 years in this business. I hope I never have it happen again." We called the police together, right there in the lobby, and gave a joint statement an hour later. A patrol officer arrived, followed by Detective Ruiz, who specialized in financial fraud and, it turned out, had seen this exact pattern before, a parent using a child's clean credit to prop up a failing business. Detective Ruiz took my folder, my timeline, my metadata report, and told me it was some of the most organized evidence she'd seen a victim bring in without a lawyer. I didn't tell her that organizing chaos into evidence was essentially my job. Before the patrol officer arrived, in that quiet stretch after my father hung up, Desmond finally spoke. "For what it's worth," he told me, "I've worked this building 6 years. I've seen a lot of family drama come through that front door. I've never seen anyone handle it the way you just did." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. And he nodded back and went to hold the door for the officer. It was a small moment, easy to leave out, but I've kept it anyway because it was the first time since the phone call that anyone had looked at what I was doing and called it strength instead of stubbornness. By the time Doyle left that afternoon, he shook my hand and told me he hoped I had people around me who'd help me through what was coming. Coming like a weather system rather than a single storm. I would find out over the following weeks exactly how much was still headed my way. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected and slower than I could stand, sometimes in the same afternoon. Detective Ruiz opened a formal identity theft and forgery investigation within 3 days. Because the evidence was so clean, my father was charged less than a month later with felony forgery and attempted fraud, plus a separate count tied to the freight authorization he falsified with my building. He was released on a $5,000 bond that same week, which meant I spent that entire month half expecting my phone to ring at 2 a.m. again, the way it always had. Except this time, I'd changed his ringtone to silence weeks earlier, and I never once regretted it. The financial side took longer to untangle. I spent 3 separate afternoons on the phone with Doyle Surplus and Wholesale's insurance carrier, then with 2 credit bureaus, disputing the account my father had opened. I submitted notarized affidavits, police report numbers, the metadata report Ruiz had validated. Northgate's legal department, once I explained, assigned one of our own compliance attorneys to help me draft dispute letters. It felt like a strange mercy, being handed professional help for a problem I usually solved for other people. It took 11 weeks before every trace of the wholesale account was fully cleared from my credit file. I checked it obsessively, like checking a wound to see if it's actually healing. Bailey Freight and Logistics didn't survive the spring. Doyle's civil claim forced my father into a settlement that required liquidating what remained of the company's equipment. I heard about the auction from my aunt, not him. He never called to tell me himself. I think some part of him still believed admitting the business was gone would be admitting that everything he'd done to save it had been for nothing. My mother's reaction was the one I braced for longest and understood least. She called me 2 days after his arrest and said quietly that she'd known about some of it. Not the forgery, she swore, but the jet ski, the banking information. She'd known in the vague, unspoken way people know things they've trained themselves not to look at directly, that something like this was building. Why didn't you tell me? I asked, my voice shaking. Because I was scared of what would happen if I did, she said. And because some part of me kept hoping he'd stop before it got this far. I didn't yell. I understood, even angry, that 32 years inside someone else's storm teaches you a particular kind of silence. But I told her, gently and clearly, that her silence had cost me something real, and that I needed time before I could be in a room with both of them again.
She cried.
I let her. I didn't take it back. Tyler surprised me most. For the first 2 weeks, he sided fully with our father, texting me that I was tearing the family apart over money, the same script I'd heard from my father, which told me exactly where Tyler had learned to talk about me. But 3 weeks in, Doyle's attorney deposed Tyler about what he'd known. It became clear my father had told Tyler the inventory deal was fully legitimate, backed by a business partner. No mention of my name. Tyler had been used too, just less thoroughly. He called me after that deposition, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. He told me it was all set up clean, Claire. He told me you knew and you were fine with it. I believed him.
I'm sorry.
I should have called you myself instead of just believing what he said about you. It wasn't a full repair, but it was a start, something I hadn't expected from Tyler at all. We're still building something new, slowly, carefully. The wider family split in ways I couldn't have predicted. My father's side, mostly, closed ranks around him. My mother's side, quieter, split down the middle. Some called to check on me. A couple of aunts I barely knew sent long, careful messages about their own complicated fathers, as if my situation gave them permission to finally say something they'd carried for decades. I hadn't expected my story to become a key that unlocked other people's stories, but it did, repeatedly, making the ordeal feel less isolating. Word moved through the freight community. 2 of my father's longtime clients called Doyle directly, asking if they should be worried about their own paperwork. Doyle told me my father's reputation, built patiently over 2 decades, unraveled within 6 weeks. It felt like its own kind of justice, slower than a courtroom, but in some ways more thorough. One of those former clients, a produce distributor, reached out to me directly that autumn, not for anything transactional, just to say he was sorry. He'd always liked me as a kid running around the warehouse. I hadn't expected strangers from my childhood to weigh in, but the ones who did almost without exception landed gently. The unexpected ally in all of this was my father's own sister, my Aunt Ellen Bailey Ross. I'd seen her maybe twice a year, always pleasant but distant. Ellen called me a week after the arrest. I braced myself for another version of my mother's call. Instead, she said, "I watched him do a version of this to our own parents 30 years ago. Smaller scale, but the same shape. I should have warned you. I was wrong." Ellen became the family member I ended up closest to. She sent me the name of a good financial forensics attorney. She sat with me on the phone the night before I gave a formal statement to Ruiz's office, talking me through what to expect. Blood, it turns out, isn't the same thing as safety, and safety isn't always where the closest blood is. Ellen taught me that gently. Detective Ruiz also became a steadying presence. She checked in every few weeks with actual updates, walked me through each stage of the process. Near the end, she told me that most victims in cases like mine came in with far less organized documentation and far more shame about why they hadn't seen it coming sooner. "You did the hardest part before you even walked in here," she said. "You believe the evidence over the relationship. Most people can't do that, even when the evidence is sitting right in front of them." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else. It's a strange compliment, believing your own eyes over your own father, but I understood. It became a small, hard, quiet kind of pride. My father made 2 more attempts to reach me before the criminal case moved to a plea agreement. The first was a handwritten letter, mailed to my apartment. It apologized in the vague, sweeping way his apologies always had. "Sorry for the pain this has caused. Sorry you feel this way." Without ever naming a single specific thing he'd done. I read it twice and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. The second attempt was worse. He showed up outside Northgate's building on a Thursday afternoon in July, waiting near the parking garage. I saw him before he saw me, standing by the concrete pillar in a jacket I recognized from a decade of family photos. Something in my chest went cold and steady, the way it had on that loading dock. I didn't approach him. I called building security from inside the lobby, gave them a description, and waited until they confirmed he'd left before I walked to my car. I filed a report with Ruiz's office that evening. There were no further attempts after that. I don't know if the report scared him off, or if he simply ran out of angles. I've stopped trying to guess at his reasoning. It cost me too many years already. There was a night in early August, sitting alone in my apartment, with the freight paperwork long closed out and the credit disputes resolved, when the anger finally ran out and something quieter took its place. I found myself looking at an old photo on my phone, my father teaching me to parallel park when I was 15. Patient in a way I'd almost forgotten he was capable of being. Before the fire, before the debt, before whatever version of him decided my life was a resource instead of a relationship. I cried that night, not for the man who'd forged my signature, but for the one in that photo. The one I'd apparently lost somewhere between then and now, without ever getting a chance to say goodbye properly. Grief doesn't always arrive at the funeral. Sometimes it arrives 8 months after a phone call at 2 a.m., quietly, while you're doing the dishes, missing someone who technically is still alive and simply isn't the person you're grieving anymore. Desmond, of all people, became a quiet fixture in that stretch of my life. He never made it a thing, but he started leaving my mail with a little extra care, letting me know when packages arrived, checking in with a simple, "You doing all right, Miss Bailey?" on nights he could tell I'd had a hard day. Small kindnesses, offered without an agenda, meant more to me that year than they probably would have in any other. I brought him a coffee most Fridays after that. Not because I owed him anything, but because I wanted to. It was strange learning the shape of an ordinary, uncomplicated relationship again, one where nobody needed anything from me beyond basic decency. At Northgate, my manager pulled me into his office once the arrest made its way through the local business press. He didn't ask for details. He just told me to take whatever time I needed for court dates and offered to shift a deadline on a client audit. It was such a small professional courtesy, and it undid me more than I expected, sitting there blinking back tears over a rescheduled deliverable, because it was the first time in months someone in a position of authority had simply accommodated me without extracting a cost. Thanksgiving came and went that year without either of my parents at my table. I hosted Tyler and Ellen and two friends from Northgate who didn't have family nearby. And it was, against every expectation, one of the better holidays I can remember having in a decade. My mother called that evening alone, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing important. It felt like the first real conversation we'd had in years that wasn't managing a crisis he'd caused. The plea agreement was finalized in late September. My father pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, forgery in the second degree, in exchange for the fraud count being dropped and a sentencing recommendation of probation instead of prison, contingent on full restitution to Frank Doyle. I sat in the back of the courtroom, 3 rows behind him, close enough to see the back of his neck. The way his shoulders had rounded. He didn't turn around once. I don't know if he knew I was there. The judge ordered $42,000 in restitution to Doyle, paid out over 3 years, along with 5 years of probation, and a formal record that would follow him into every future business application. It wasn't the outcome that would have satisfied the furious, cold me on that loading dock, but Ruiz told me it was about as thorough an outcome as these cases usually produce. And thoroughness, I was learning, was its own kind of justice, quieter than the version I'd imagined, but no less real. I gave a victim impact statement before sentencing. For paragraphs I'd rewritten a dozen times, cutting anything that sounded like pleading, keeping only what was true. I told the court I wasn't asking for punishment out of anger. I told them I was asking the record to reflect permanently that what had happened was not a family disagreement that had gotten out of hand, but a calculated use of my identity by someone who had access to it because he was supposed to be trustworthy, not because he'd earned trust. I said the hardest part hadn't been the fraud itself. It had been realizing how long the fraud had actually been running, disguised as love, disguised as family, long before the freight truck or the forged contract ever entered the picture. When I sat back down, my mother, across the aisle, was crying quietly. She didn't look at my father. She looked at me once and nodded, small and slow, in a way that told me she'd finally heard something she'd been too frightened to hear for 32 years. It's been a little over a year now since that phone call. And I want to tell you, my life looks completely different. But the truth is quieter than that. I still live at the Wilmot, Unit 14C. I repainted the living room last spring, a deep, warm gray that has nothing to do with freight or forgiveness, and everything to do with wanting a room in my own apartment to finally just belong to me unconditionally. The biometric lock Desmond installed that first cold morning is still the only way in. I've never once regretted the inconvenience of being the only name on my own front door. I got promoted at Northgate in the spring, senior compliance lead now, overseeing the same kind of digital forensics work that ended up saving me when I needed it most. There's something almost funny about that. In a dark, private way I don't explain to coworkers who ask how I got so good at reading metadata reports under pressure. I tell them I had a complicated year. Most people don't push past that. The ones who do, I tell the short version, the freight, the forged signature, the lobby, and I watch their faces do the same thing every time, a kind of stunned recalibration, like they're quietly refiling what family is supposed to mean. Tyler and I talk most weeks now. Sometimes just texts about nothing. Sometimes real conversations that last an hour. He moved into his own place in Golden this past winter, the first time he's lived somewhere our father didn't have a key to. I think that mattered to him more than he said out loud. Ellen and I have dinner once a month, an easy, unhurried tradition neither of us planned. Just something that happened because we both, it turned out, needed somebody in this family who'd tell the truth, even when it wasn't flattering. My mother and I are rebuilding something slower and more careful. No dramatic reconciliation, just phone calls that have gotten a little longer each month. A visit at Easter that didn't end in anyone crying in a bathroom. She filed for divorce in January. I didn't push her, and I didn't discourage her. I just told her I'd support whatever she decided, and I meant it. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I think she believed me instantly. She moved into a small rental near the elementary school where she still teaches. When I helped her carry boxes in, she stopped in the middle of the empty living room, looked around at the bare walls, and said quietly, "I forgot what it feels like to pick furniture nobody else has an opinion about." I understood that sentence more completely than almost anything else she said to me all year. We spent that afternoon at a HomeGoods picking out a lamp for her new reading corner. No urgency, no crisis underneath it, just my mother and me comparing two nearly identical lamps for 20 unhurried minutes. And I remember thinking, standing in that fluorescent-lit aisle, that this was probably as close to an apology as I was ever going to get from either of my parents. And that it was, against every expectation, enough. I still keep the original folder from that spring, the timeline, the metadata report, the screenshots, filed away in a drawer I rarely open. I kept it, at first out of habit. Lately, I think I keep it for a different reason. Some nights, doing the ordinary, unremarkable things that make up an ordinary life, it would be easy to let the last year soften into something smaller than it was. A bad patch, a rough stretch. Family stuff. The folder keeps me honest about what actually happened. It reminds me that I didn't overreact, that the version of events I lived through was exactly as serious as it felt at 4 a.m. on that loading dock. And that trusting my own account of my own life, even when the people who were supposed to love me most insisted I was wrong, was the single most important skill I used that year. More useful, in the end, than any degree, any audit, any professional certification framed on my office wall. My father completed the first year of his probation without incident, as far as I know, though at secondhand. He hasn't tried to contact me since the day outside my office. I don't know if that's growth or exhaustion or simple legal caution. I've stopped needing to know which. There was a version of me standing on that loading dock 14 months ago who would have told you closure meant an apology. A real one, specific and unflinching. The kind he was never capable of giving me, even when he tried. I don't need that version of closure anymore. I found a version that doesn't depend on him at all, which turned out to be the only version that was ever actually mine to have. I think about that email from Desmond sometimes, the automated one. Freight delivery 6 a.m., temporary elevator override authorized under my name. And how ordinary it looked at first glance. How easy it would have been to miss if I'd been even a little more tired, a little less careful, a little more willing to give my father the benefit of a doubt he'd spent years quietly using against me. I don't think of that email as the moment my father revealed who he was. I think of it as the moment I finally let myself see what had been true for a very long time. The freight truck was never really about freight. It was about whether I would keep clearing space in my own life for someone who only ever showed up to fill it with his emergencies. I don't hate my father. I want to say that clearly, because I think people expect a story like this to end in something sharper than what I actually feel. Some clean, satisfying fury that ties the whole thing off neatly. What I feel instead is closer to grief with the volume turned down. A permanent low hum underneath an otherwise good life. I love the man who taught me to parallel park in that church parking lot. I don't know exactly when he became someone else, or whether he was always both people at once, and I simply hadn't been forced yet to notice the second one. Either way, I lost him twice. Once slowly, over years I didn't fully register while they were happening. And once completely, all at once, on a loading dock at dawn, in 12-degree cold, in front of a stranger's idling truck. Sometimes I try to pinpoint the exact moment the shift happened, the way you'd trace a crack in a foundation back to its origin point, and I can never quite land on a single one. Maybe it was the warehouse fire in 2019, the loss he never let himself grieve properly before he started looking for ways to recoup it. Maybe it was earlier than that, some smaller failure from his own childhood that taught him love and utility were the same currency long before I was born. I'll never know for certain, and I've made a kind of peace with not knowing, because the not knowing doesn't change what I owe myself now, a life built on people who show up without an invoice attached. If there's a thing I'd want anyone listening to this to take with them, it's this: love that only shows up asking for something isn't love being generous. It's a bill with better manners. I spent 29 years mistaking my father's demands for closeness, because closeness was the only language he ever offered me. And I didn't know yet that I was allowed to want a different one. I know now my living room belongs to me. My name belongs to me. And every morning I wake up in that apartment, gray walls, single lock, nobody's emergency but my own, I understand a little better that peace was never going to arrive as a triumph. It arrived quietly, as a room I finally didn't have to clear for anyone.